Chapter 10. Automobile Advertising. I wrote my first advertisements on automobiles in 1899. They referred to a steam car made in Milwaukee. My book on the car was entitled The Sport of Kings. The model I owned was the first motor car in Racine. My first day of ownership cost me $300 through the scaring of hack horses and other forms of damage. I was chauffeur and garageman. It required 30 minutes to start the car, which we had to count on in catching a train. And on more than that. Starting was a small problem when compared with keeping the car going. When we drove 10 miles without a breakdown, we boasted of the record. When we ever got through to Milwaukee, about 25 miles, we went directly to the factory for repairs, and we rarely returned that day. Every 10 miles we stopped for water. Then we watched the boiler gauge. As the car moved, it pumped water, but it often moved too slowly on the roads of those days to keep the boiler supplied. Our seat was on top of the boiler. I remember nights on muddy roads when we watched the water gauge go down. At a certain point, we knew the boiler would explode, but we kept on going to shorten our walk back home. There are pleasanter experiences than sitting on a boiler on a gloomy night, waiting for it to explode, and contemplating the long, muddy road ahead. But that experience made me an automobile enthusiast. In the time since then, I have written successful automobile ads about some 20 cars. In my early days with Lord and Thomas, Hugh Chalmers brought out the Thomas Detroit car, and he came to consult me about it. Mr. Chalmers was a remarkable man. He had been, it was said, the highest paid sales manager in the United States with the National Cash Register Company. I learned much of salesmanship from him, and I was gratified to note that in all our years together, he and I never disagreed. The problems in automobile advertising then were different from the problems now. For years, the situation was constantly changing like a kaleidoscope. One had to keep well informed to strike the responsive chord. I featured Howard E. Coffin, then chief engineer for the Chalmers Company. You will note that whenever possible, I inject some personality into an advertising campaign. This has always proved itself an impressive idea. People like to deal with men whose names are connected with certain accomplishments. They would rather do that, I have found, than deal with soulless corporations. Naming an expert in an advertising campaign indicates a man of unique ability and prominence. He may be unknown to the public, he generally is at the start. But when a manufacturer features him, people accord him respect. He soon becomes famous, then his name becomes an exclusive feature of great value. Howard Coffin was unknown when I first featured him. Advertising gave him such prominence that he was made head of the aircraft board in the war. For somewhat similar reasons, an individual's name is usually better than a coined name on a product, and far better than a trademark. It locates the sponsor as a man proud of his creation. It is far easier to make a man famous than an institution. Consider how much names count in theatrical productions, in the movies, or in authorship. They are often names created for the purpose. It is also so in merchandising. In those early days, Cadillac and Chalmers cars sold at about the same price, around $1,500. Cadillac had an older reputation, and it was a much handsomer car. But the featuring of Howard E. Coffin gave to the Chalmers a distinction which brought it great success. We met other conditions as they came up. We found a growing impression that automobile profits were excessive. We met the situation with headlines announcing, "Our profit is 9%. Then we stated the actual costs on many hidden parts. The total was over $700, and it omitted all the conspicuous parts, like the body, upholstery, etc. That brings up another point in advertising, the advantage of being specific. Platitudes and generalities make no more impression than water on a duck. To say best in the world, cheapest in the long run, the most economical, etc., does not create conviction. Such claims are expected. The most carefully censored magazines accept them as merely expressions of a salesman trying to put his best foot forward. They are not classed as falsehoods, but as mere exaggerations. They probably do more harm than good because they indicate a looseness of expression and cause people to discount whatever you say. But when we make specific and definite claims, when we state actual figures or facts, we indicate weighed and measured expressions. We are telling either the truth or a lie. People do not expect big concerns to lie. They know that we cannot lie in the best mediums, so we get full credit for those claims. I shall have other occasions to cite the advantages of definite, specific claims. The Hudson Company was an offshoot of the Chalmers Company. Mr. Chalmers was interested. The Hudson Company was organized because the Chalmers Company was overmanned in the selling end. Howard E. Coffin went with the Hudson, and I featured him there. But we went further. We pictured and named our board of 48 engineers. Then we advertised the Hudson as an engineering accomplishment. That accorded with the conditions of the times. Motor cars were not then perfected. Troubles were common. The average buyer thought more of good engineering than any other factor. We made the Hudson stand for that in a very conspicuous way. That proved itself a sound foundation. The Hudson car has been a great success, and it remains so still. The reason lies largely in that underpinning which we built in those early days. I advertised the Hudson car for 7 years, then relinquished the advertising to a protege of mine who continued very similar policies. The story of the Overland reads like a romance. Mr. John Willies ran a store in Elmira, New York, called the Elmira Arms Company. He sold bicycles. Then, when the automobile made its appearance, he secured the agency for the Overland, then built at Indianapolis. The Overland proved itself at that time one of the few satisfactory cars. One sold another until the demand in the Elmira territory far exceeded the supply. Mr. Willies took orders with deposits and sent the deposits down to Indianapolis. But the cars failed to come, so he went to Indianapolis to learn the reason and arrived on a Sunday morning. He met the Overland owners at the hotel, and they told him they were bankrupt. They had failed to meet their payroll the night before. They owed some $45,000 more than they could pay. Mr. Willies could not return his deposits, so he sought for a way to obtain the cars. He said, "If you are bankrupt, you cannot continue the business." "No," they replied, "we are quitting." "Then I suppose I can continue it," Mr. Willies said. "Will you turn it over to me, debts and all?" They told him they would. The defaulted payroll was $450. Mr. Willies set about to raise it. He borrowed some money from the hotel clerk. He had a little of his own. The next morning he called the workmen together and paid them the wages due. Then he said, "Get together a car, find parts enough, and quickly. We must raise more money." They did put together a car, and Mr. Willies shipped it to a friend in Allentown, Pennsylvania. With it he sent a letter somewhat as follows. "Dear Albert, I have shipped you an Overland car, sight draft with bill lading attached. It is necessary that you accept it, for I have cashed the sight draft and have used the money." Dear Albert did accept it. Then they made up other cars and shipped them in the same way. About 4 in 5 of them stuck. The demand came for more cars, and the problem of financing became acute. Mr. Willies went to the creditors with his famous, inimitable smile. He said, "You will get nothing if you close us up, for we have nothing there. But give me a chance, and I will try to pull through and pay you every dollar we owe." The creditors accepted that proposition because they saw no other way out. Mr. Willies raised some more money, a very little, and went on. Soon the factory capacity was oversold. There was no time to build more plants, so he erected tents. And in those tents, he made that season, I believe, $365,000. I do not vouch for all the figures. I am telling the story from memory. But the essentials are correct and indicative. Then Mr. Willies decided to go back to Elmira and build a factory there. That was his hometown. While he was shaving one night to take the train, his agent in Toledo called him up. He told of a plant in Toledo, the Pope Toledo plant, which was closed and bankrupt. He said, "Come and see it. You will find it wonderfully equipped, and you will find steel enough and parts enough to pay the price they ask." As a result, Mr. Willies stopped off at Toledo. He walked through the plant the next day, then went on to New York and bought it. The next day he sailed for Europe. When he returned, he found that his people had sold the steel alone for far more than the cost of the plant. As I said before, this story may not be quite accurate, but it illustrates the point I bring out. The essentials are there. The next season, I took up the Overland advertising, the first advertising they ever did. I analyzed the situation to find its most appealing features, but nothing in all the data I gathered appealed to me like the romance. So my first ads were headed, "The Wonderful Overland Story." I told how demands from users had led John E. Willies to undertake to supply them, how that demand had grown and grown, until it was necessary to erect a plant of tents. Again, that limelight's a principle in advertising. People are like sheep. They cannot judge values, nor can you and I. We judge things largely by others' impressions, by popular favor. We go with the crowd. So the most effective thing I have ever found in advertising is the trend of the crowd. That is a factor not to be overlooked. People follow styles and preferences. We rarely decide for ourselves because we don't know the facts. But when we see the crowds taking any certain direction, we are much inclined to go with them. I showed in my advertising how the crowds were going to Overland automobiles. I told how the demand had forced a bankrupt concern into solvency. Then how it created a tent city. That presentation set people thinking, and they followed the trend. The Overland became, as it is today, one of the largest selling cars in the world. The Rio at one time had a bad season. The season's output was unsold and sales had practically stopped. The next season's outlook was dubious. I was called in to meet this emergency. That has been my chief work in advertising, meeting emergencies. Nobody ever called me in when the skies were bright and the seas were calm. Nearly every client quit me when he got into smooth waters. That was partly my fault, for I liked emergencies. I would rather be a pilot than a captain. When an advertising ship got on its clear course, I lost much interest in it. The work became monotonous. I was always ready to drop off and pilot another. Then continuous advertising along one line grows monotonous to the advertiser. He feels that the public reads his story as often as he does. So in the course of time, he comes to desire a change. I could never agree with this viewpoint. When I find what seems to be the right course, I always wish to keep it. There may be another way to success, even to greater success, but the chances are against it. The ways to great success in any line are not numerous. When a certain method has proved itself profitable, I hesitate to drop it until I have found and proved a better method by some local tests. The best way to sell a product to thousands is probably the best way to sell other thousands. Every ad, in my opinion, should tell a complete story. It should include every fact and argument found to be valuable. Most people, I figure, read a story but once as they do a news item. I know of no reason why they should read it again. So I wish them to get in that one reading every convincing fact. Any complete story told over and over is bound to grow monotonous to the man who reads all ads. It bores the man who writes it. Both the writer and reader come to long for a change. I studied the Rio situation, then went away to consider it. The car was built by Mr. R. E. Olds, one of the original motor car builders. I considered that fact, the existing misfortunes, and all competition that affected the case. The difficult conditions called for effective measures. In a few days I went back and told Mr. Olds that I would undertake the advertising on 3 conditions. The first was that he named the new model Rio the Fifth. That to give a distinctive name and to emphasize the fact that we had a new model. The next condition was that Mr. Olds sign the ads. that to gain full effect from his great reputation. I told him I would write ads he would be proud to sign, and he agreed. Then I stipulated that he call it my farewell car, that to signify a degree of finality and his satisfaction with it. But, he replied, I don't intend to retire. I said that was unnecessary. Sarah Bernhardt made 7 farewell tours. He could have 2 or 3. Every farewell is subject to reconsideration. So we came out with ads headed, My Farewell Car, and signed R.E. Olds, designer. The ads were written to typify the man of rugged honesty, of vast experience, the man who knew, the man who scorned to do anything but the best that was possible, regardless of its cost. The man who put his reputation far ahead of profit. The campaign from the start was a sensational success. Rio V became at once the most conspicuous car of the year. A new era dawned for the Rio Company, and that era has continued until that concern is one of the soundest and most successful in the field. The most successful automobile advertising I ever did resulted in disaster due to other causes. That was the Mitchell advertising. I was called there to meet an emergency. As always, I gave an enormous amount of study to the automobile situation, to current ideas and trends. I concluded that the best keynote was efficiency. Efficiency was then a popular subject with men in all lines of business. The Mitchell Company had an able efficiency expert. They had a very efficient plant. So I came out with ads headed John W. Bate, efficiency expert, and I told of the man and his methods. That campaign was also a sensation. I never knew any automobile advertising to bring so many inquiries. Sales started at an amazing rate. I had struck the popular chord. Buyers of motor cars wanted, above all else, economies due to efficiency. Soon the company was on the road to great success. It was recapitalized in a large way. But the car was a fizzle. Its engineers had skimped in every detail. Hundreds of cars came back, and every car sold blighted the name Mitchell. The larger the sales, the worse became the ruin. The very success of the advertising with the car that was offered led to destruction. We played too high a note for the product we had to sell. The bad reputation was so widely spread that recovery proved impossible. That formed another lesson in advertising. In 1924, I was called on to advertise the Studebaker car. For several years, I had been out of the automobile field. I had to educate myself in existing conditions. That is always essential. One can never strike the right chord until he knows the trend of popular opinion. I studied the situation for weeks. Studebaker had been a tremendous success. The multiplying sales, increasing assets and profits had become a stock market sensation. I concluded that those facts, always encouraging to men watching the weather, had been a major factor in Studebaker's success. So I decided to build upon them. The result was a campaign with which all are familiar. We cited those multiplying sales. We stated the assets and the facilities they embodied. We showed by actual figures how quantity production reduced costs. We told the cost of certain features compared with features used by others. We gave actual figures, and we showed how we could afford those extravagances by producing 150,000 cars per year. That proved a new note, and today an ultimate note in automobile advertising. The lesson in this is the lesson in all salesmanship. One must know what buyers are thinking about and what they are coming to want. One must know the trends to be a leader in a winning trend. Advertising to many is mere ad writing. Language and style are considered important. They are not. If fine writing is effective in any way, it is a detriment. It suggests an effort to sell, and every effort to sell creates corresponding resistance. Salesmanship in print is exactly the same as salesmanship in person. Style is a handicap. Anything that takes attention from the subject reduces the impression. One may say, that is a beautiful ad. The pictures are perfect. The presentation is wonderful. But that very idea prohibits one from being influenced by the ad. It indicates lack of sincerity. It suggests an effort to sell. And we are all on our guard when somebody apparently is trying to get our money away. The only way to sell is in some way to seem to offer super service. It may be offered in a crude way. The majority of advertising successes have been accomplished in crude ways. They struck a human chord in a human way. They seem to offer wanted service. That is why so much fine advertising fails to bring results. People are wary of it, and why so many successes are made in ways that seem crude. They are made by super salesmen who forget themselves.